So when I watched the show, which again I enjoyed very much, I was talking to a friend of mine who I went to see the show with, and yeah, that was something I wanted to ask you. So, was the fairy element was that a metaphor, or is that actually a nod to the history of fairies just in the world, or a little bit of both?
Well, I think as a queer person, it's one of the first things you're called when you're a
Sure.
child, and you get tagged with that name and you associate yourself with fairies, and for good or for bad, right? Like you just think like, oh, how'd they know? And as I got older, I sort of decided that I was going to, just like we reclaimed the word queer, there was something I wanted to explore about reclaiming the word fairy and the idea of fairies. And just like fairies, queer people have had to be invisible at certain times in the history of the world, and then sometimes make themselves visible for various reasons. So it's sort of both. It sort of plays with the
Mhm.
whole idea of queerness and the whole idea of fairies.
Yeah. So would I
And as fairies are, it's very playful.
Okay, sorry, you froze there for a split second. I thought yeah, sorry
Oh,
about that.
sorry.
Um, but, yeah, 'cause I is that are there, like, people who not, like, identify as fairies, but, like, fairy how there's some people who they consider themselves witches, and that usually has nothing to do with the decorations you see at Halloween. It's a totally, different thing, and that's always been very fascinating to me. The fact that yes, there are witches, there are vampires. And that I don't know a ton about, but I do know it's a thing in New Orleans. But is that a thing with fairies as well, to your
Well,
knowledge?
in the queer community, there are a group of people called radical fairies, and radical fairies, they have a very particular ethos, and they live slightly, off the grid when they go. They go into the woods, and they all live together, and there are places where you can go to be a radical fairy, and in their lives, they consider themselves radical fairies. They're, um, they're like a tribe of, they're a subset of gays, and for me, I consider myself a fairy. Like I
Uh-huh.
just, I consider myself, I'm many things. I'm queer, I'm gay, I'm non-binary, but I just, as I got older, I was like, oh, that's what I am. I'm a fairy, and I always was. And um, one of the things that I ask people to do in the show, as you know, is to basically, I ask if there are any fairies in the house. I ask if there are any witches or wizards or elves.
Yeah.
And the idea is that everybody has like a access to a magical component of themselves, right? Like the part of themselves that are magic. One hopes they still have that. You certainly had it when you were a kid. And for me, the access that I had to magic as a child was my fairy self. So when I ask people if to identify themselves, it's so much fun.
Mhm.
For instance, speaking of witches, there was a 12-year-old girl who raised her hand, and her parents were there, and they kind of looked at her like, what? And she told me, she said, well, do you know what witch stands for? And I was like, no, I don't think so. Tell me. And she said, it stands for a woman in total control of herself. 12 years old.
That's so cool.
So it's wonderful to allow people to have this sort of public declaration of their magical self, because I really believe that the way that we're going to be able to navigate through this very difficult time that we're facing, or that we're in, is to be able to access something in ourselves that is kind of almost greater than our human limitations. Like we just have to find some, and I don't mean magic in the sense of, um, you know, just believing things and making them happen. I actually think magic takes a lot of work
Mm.
to actually make it kick in. So it's just a
How
way.
so?
Well, I think theater is a great example, or making any kind of art. Like what you're really striving for is this sense of wonder. You're trying to get people to feel wonder, and whether it's rough wonder or delightful wonder, you're getting people. You want people to be sitting there and go like, "Wow!" And as you know, as an artist yourself, it takes a lot of work to make a little bit of magic, and that's, you have to make it look effortless as well. So I think that that's really what I mean by magic. There's a beautiful quote. Elizabeth Gilbert, the writer, said, "Magic is simply knowing what wants to happen next." And I think that artists in particular are magicians in that sense, because our job is to really look at the culture and try to figure out, like, what's coming? What do we what are we doing here? And what's the next thing? You have to be a little bit ahead of the curve, right? As
Hmm.
a creative person.
So could you tell me a little bit more about the radical fairy movement? Like when did it kind of start? I mean, this is my first time hearing about it, so I'm very intrigued.
Well, the radical fairies started around the 1960s. It came out of the sort of hippie culture. And admittedly, I'm not an expert on radical fairies, but there are places around the United States. There are fairy camps, and people go, and they live there for a time, like
Hmm.
what we would call a vacation. They go into the woods and they live as fairies in the woods. And and I haven't done it because I'm not a radical fairy. I'm just a freelance fairy representing my own fairiness. Um, so you'd have to ask a radical fairy, like, for personal testimony.